Boccaccio's Decameron. Day 3, just the introduction. On the following Sunday, when already the dawn was beginning to change from vermilion to orange, with the approach of the sun, the queen arose and summoned all her companions. Some time earlier, the steward had dispatched most of the things they required to their new quarters, together with servants to make all necessary preparations for their arrival. And once the queen herself had set out, he promptly saw that everything else was loaded onto the baggage train, as though he were striking camp, and then departed with the rest of the servants who had remained behind with the ladies and gentlemen. Meanwhile, the queen, accompanied by and followed by her ladies and three young men, and guided by the song of perhaps a score of nightingales and other birds, struck out westward at a leisurely pace along a little used path carpeted with grass and flowers, whose petals were gradually opening to greet the morning sun. After walking no more than 2 miles, she brought them long before Tierce was half spent, to a most beautiful and ornate palace, which was situated on a slight eminence above the plain. Entering the palace, they explored it from end to end and were filled with admiration for its spacious halls and well-kept elegant rooms, which were equipped with everything they could possibly need. And they came to the conclusion that only a gentleman of the highest rank could have owned it. And when they descended to inspect the huge sunlit courtyard, the cellars stocked with excellent wines, and the well containing abundant supplies of fresh ice-cold water, they praised it even more. The whole place was decked with seasonable flowers and cuttings, and by way of repose they seated themselves in a loggia overlooking the central court. Here they were met by the steward, who had thoughtfully laid on a supply of delectable sweetmeats and precious wines for their refreshment. After this, they were shown into a walled garden alongside the palace, and since it seemed at first glance to be a thing of wondrous beauty, they began to explore it in detail. The garden was surrounded and crisscrossed by paths of unusual width, all as straight as arrows and overhung with pergolas of vines, which showed every sign of yielding an abundant crop of grapes later in the year. The vines were all in flower, drenching the garden with their aroma, which, mingled with that of many other fragrant plants and herbs, gave them the feeling that they were in the midst of all the spices ever grown in the East. The path along the edges of the garden were almost entirely hemmed in by white and red roses and jasmine, so that not only in the morning, but even when the sun was at its apex, one could walk in pleasant, sweet-smelling shade without ever being touched by the sun's rays. It would take a long time to describe how numerous and varied were the shrubs growing there, or how neatly they were set out, but all the ones that ought to commend them and flourish in our climate were represented in full measure. In the central part of the garden, not the least but by far the most admirable of its features, there was a lawn of exceedingly fine grass, of so deep a green as to almost seem black, dotted all over with possibly 1,000 different kinds of gaily colored flowers, and surrounded by a line of flourishing bright green, orange, and lemon trees, which, with their mature and unripe fruit and lingering shreds of blossoms, offered agreeable shade to the eyes and a delightful aroma to the nostrils. In the middle of this lawn there stood a fountain of pure white marble, covered with marvelous bas-reliefs from a figure standing on a column. In the center of the fountain, a jet of water, whether natural or artificial I know not, but sufficiently powerful to drive a mill with ease, gushed high into the sky before cascading downwards and falling with a delectable plash into the crystal clear pool below. And from this pool, which was lapping the rim of the fountain, the water passed through hidden culvert and then emerged into a finely constructed artificial channels surrounding the lawn on all sides. Thence it flowed along similar channels through almost the whole of the beautiful garden. eventually gathering at a single place from which it issued forth from the garden and descended towards the plain as a pure, clear stream, furnishing ample power to two separate mills on its downward course, to no small advantage of the owner of this palace. The sight of this garden and the perfection of its arrangements, with its shrubs, its streamlets, and the fountain from which they originated, gave so much pleasure to each of the ladies and the three young men that they all began to maintain that if paradise were constructed on earth, it was inconceivable that it could take any other form, nor could they imagine any way in which the garden's beauty could possibly be enhanced. And as they wandered contentedly through it, making magnificent garlands for themselves from the leaves of various trees, their ears constantly filled with the sound of some 20 different kinds of birds, all singing as though they were vying with one another, they became aware of yet another delightful feature, which, being so overwhelmed by the others, they had so far failed to notice. For they had found that the garden was liberally stocked with as many as 100 different varieties of perfectly charmed animals, to which they all started drawing each other's attentions. Here were some rabbits emerging from a warren. Over there, hares were running. Elsewhere, they could observe some deer lying on the ground, and whilst in yet another place, young fawns were grazing. And apart from these, they saw numerous harmless creatures of many other kinds, roaming about as leisurely as though they were quite tame, all of which added greatly to their already considerable delight. When, however, they had wandered about the gardens for some little time, sampling its various attractions, they instructed the servants to arrange the tables around the fountain, and then they sang half a dozen canzonets, and danced several dances, after which, at the Queen's command, they all sat down to breakfast. Choice and dainty dishes, exquisitely prepared, were set before them, in unhurried succession, and when they rose from the table, merrier than when they had started, they turned once more to music, songs, and dancing. Eventually, however, as the hottest part of the day was approaching, the Queen decided that those who felt so inclined should take their siesta. Some of them accordingly retired, but the rest were so overwhelmed by the beauty of their surroundings that they remained where they were and whiled away their time in reading romances or playing chess or throwing dice whilst the others slept. But a little after nons, they all went and refreshed their faces in cool water before assembling at the Queen's request on the lawn near the fountain, where, having seated themselves in the customary manner, they began to await their turn to tell a story on the topic the Queen had approved. The first of their number to whom she entrusted this office was Philostrato, who began as follows. And then that will be the next story. Now, it's kind of interesting, remember the whole premise of the book is that these 10 people are sheltering from the plague, and they have decided to isolate themselves to prevent themselves getting the disease. But like most people who have been isolating to avoid COVID, I think we would all understand that after a few days, they kind of decided that they'd like some nicer digs. So they found them. And very much the same thing has happened in our current COVID crisis. The number of people who decide to upgrade their dwellings, either by moving, like they did, or by home improvement projects, has gone up considerably. It is interesting how history repeats itself. But anyway, I hope you've enjoyed that. Sorry I mangled a few parts. Bye-bye.